Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces here, and thank you very much to Ondo and Nate and the whole team for having us here. This is a great event and an impressive environment as well. Let me just start by saying I'm Brett Redfearn. I am Panorama Financial Markets. I ran the Division of Trading and Markets under the last Trump administration. Under Jay Clayton, I worked very closely with Bill Hinman, who was the Director of Corporate Finance. Bill is he is now an advisor to A16Z and a senior advisor at Simpson Thacher. We also have with us more from the now Commissioner Mersinger from the CFTC. It's great to have her here. She's been there since March 2022 and has consistently advocated for clear regulatory frameworks for digital assets and crypto. And of course, Chris Giancarlo, the former chair of the CFTC. He's also known as Crypto Dad, author of the book Crypto Dad, now published in Japanese, everybody should know, and senior counsel also and co-chair of Willkie Farr's Digital Works practice. So with that in mind, let's dive in. We are here to talk about a lot of what we expect we might see in the next 2 to 4 years with respect to policy in digital assets and in crypto generally. It's a very interesting time, as you all know. We have a change of administration. We have substantial influence coming in from the crypto lobby. Great expectations for significant, additional clarity and breakthroughs in crypto policy. But I think with that being said, there's also a great awareness that acts of Congress don't come quickly. They take a long time to implement. They're subject to a lot of negotiation and compromise, and they rarely deliver everything that is hoped for. And certainly also the CFTC and the SEC are limited by existing statutes. There's a lot of litigation that they've been facing, and that some people might have liked the way that worked in the last few years, but that can also cut back and the other way now. And so it's going to be tough, and we're trying to have today a discussion of kind of a clear, informed, and sober view of what we think we can expect with all of this environment in place. I think the first thing that we want to talk about is all of the enforcement activity that's been out there. We all know that there's been a lot of litigation, regulation by enforcement. We're excited to turn the page from that particular environment. And so I think the first question I want to throw out to our panelists here is, understanding that none of you can speak to any of the specific cases that are out there, and that wouldn't really be appropriate, certainly for acting commissioner. At a high level, I'm curious, what do you think happens with all this litigation that is out there? Do you think cases are going to be dropped? Do you think that they're going to be settled? Or do you think that we're actually going to see crypto policy being formed in the process of that settlement process? And maybe I'll kind of open it up to see who wants to go first on that.
I'll start if you want. Well, I think it is a new day on the enforcement front. In conversations we're having with people in the building, it looks like a lot of the enforcement staff have been reassigned from the crypto enforcement team to other positions, still largely in enforcement. The tone in the building is one of, it won't be regulation by enforcement. It will be, there'll still be cases where there's fraud. There's still a lot of, things across all the industries that the SEC regulates where fraud is still going to be a prime concern. The gotcha cases, again, across the industries where maybe the laws hadn't been as clear, not just in crypto, but in other areas as well, I think are going to take much less of a priority. I think right now, going into this administration, there probably were about 10% of the enforcement personnel allocated to crypto cases. I think that'll get scaled way back. Whether cases will settle and whether law will be made in those situations, hard to predict. I do think many cases will go on the back burner. I think people will have an opportunity to settle if they like. We might see the SEC start to use 21A again a little bit more, which is a way to resolve a case where you don't have a financial penalty, particularly in cases where the law hadn't been clear. But I do think going forward, we'll see much less emphasis on trying to make policy through those cases, trying to do that through guidance, rulemaking, public comment. It is, I think, generally a new area.
I'll try to take a shot at this, and I'll approach it perhaps from a higher altitude point of view. In my experience, all organizations take their tone from the people at the top. We've got different types of people at the top now. The last few administrations, except for Trump 45, it was the political class and it was a lot of lawyers. And the approach that certainly was there during Biden was it's mother may I before you proceed with innovation. The tone from the top now is not a lot of lawyers, not a lot of political class, a lot of entrepreneurs. And they want to get back to an environment that's a traditional American, certainly a Silicon Valley environment, which says, if you're not breaking something, you're not moving fast enough. Don't ask permission, ask forgiveness. And so the way I think that's going to work its way down to the enforcement level by the market regulators is going to be less going after firms, and I've heard this phrase used in the new administration, for foot faults. Let's play the game. Or, to use a football analogy, too many penalties ruin the game, and if the game is about entrepreneurship, it's about building businesses, about building in America, we can't have every play flagged. We've got to have a more permissive. Now, that doesn't extend to fraud and manipulation. There's going to be the same, if not a greater emphasis on fraud and manipulation. But for technical violations, I think they're going to say, look, if you're building something legitimate that's a technical violation, we'll deal with it as a technical violation, not necessarily an enforcement action or Wells notice, all of the stuff that's been used to stifle innovation over the last 4 years.
And I'll give my quick legal disclaimer that I have to give as a government employee that the views I share today are my own and not necessarily those of the commissioner, my fellow commissioners. So I kind of put these cases in two buckets. There's the bucket of fraud. And I've always been a little frustrated that everyone has called it crypto fraud because in my experience from what I've seen, they just call it crypto fraud, but it's fraud. They take your money, they misappropriate it, no crypto's purchased. That's not going to go away. We will still see, in fact, we may see more of those cases because we will have enforcement focused on that sort of activity where they should be focused because there's a lot of people losing a lot of money with the name crypto involved, but no crypto is being bought or sold. So the idea of crypto fraud, I think, is a very unfair term. It's just fraud. It's no different than any other fraud that's been perpetrated over, many, many years. Those cases will continue. We may even see more, and it's important that we continue those enforcement efforts. Where we won't see as much is this idea of, what we have done with a few cases that I've spoken out against is we have brought registration violations. And what's even more frustrating about this is sometimes we'll say in the settlement, you failed to register as maybe a contract market, maybe as a swap execution facility, maybe as a clearinghouse. We're not sure. We're not sure what you failed to register at, but you failed to register, and so we're going to ask you for a settlement. And at the end of the day, there's actually no way for these entities to come in and register as any one of those categories. So we're going to get away from that. If the idea is to get people in to register, we're going to provide some clarity, help them, how do we do this? How do we make this work? And let our enforcement team focus on what is really important, which is rooting out fraud in the markets.
That's fantastic. So we're going to pivot now to Congress and legislation. So I think a lot of us understand that a lot of statutory authority is probably needed in some of the areas where that statutory authority is not particularly clear. We had a brief prep call, and even since then, we've had more announcements. Senator Bill Hagerty announced that he's going to introduce new stablecoin legislation. We all know the Digital Asset Subcommittee in the Senate is being led by Senator Lummis, who is obviously leading on the Lummis-Gillibrand bill with Senator Gillibrand. Congressman French Hill, who ran the Digital Asset Subcommittee, is now running the House Financial Services Committee. So there's a lot of optimism in Congress, and certainly a very pro-crypto attitude. So my question now is, what do you want to see and what do you expect to see can get done in the next 2 years between stablecoin, market structure legislation, or anything else? Bill, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Well, I do think the stablecoin legislation that's been proposed in the Senate looks pretty good. And I expect, and French Hill said this the other day, that something very similar will get introduced in the House. I think as an industry, that's terrific to have some clarity there. It's one of the easier things for the Senate and the House to work on together and to get out there, and it's a good first step. I think the framework legislation is going to be tougher. French had indicated that they're going to start again with Fit 21. Many in the room probably had various issues with Fit 21. No one loved it in its entirety. There was some bifurcations there between the SEC's jurisdiction and ATS markets and the CFTC having a general market framework regime. So I think that's going to get addressed and worked out. He did say there'll be some improvements. But I think that's going to take time. In the same way that it's going to take time for the SEC to kind of turn over a new leaf to really come through with some concrete evidence that now this is a more hospitable regulatory approach. I think it's going to take a while for the Congress to actually move and to get the consensus from the agencies. One of the things that marked the last 4 years was that there was not a lot of technical assistance being given by the SEC or the CFTC, probably even less from the SEC than the CFTC, to Congress as they try to grapple with these issues. They're tough. They're ones that are very technical and where they really benefit from SEC and CFTC advice. That's going to be available again. And I think you'll see Fit 21 and whatever happens in the Senate have much more input from the agencies, and so that's going to take a little time. In the meantime, I think we will see interesting things going on in the agency. At some point, I'd love to chat about those, but let's stay focused on the legislation right now.
Great.
Brett, I was at I gave a talk at the RNC convention in Milwaukee in August on crypto in the Trump administration, and I said that I saw Trump proceeding in three buckets: the easy, the more difficult, and the very difficult. The easy was getting rid of bad policy. The more difficult was delivering on the promises made in Nashville in July, and the difficult was actually getting good policy. So what we're seeing that play out exactly like that. Getting rid of bad policy is actually moving at lightning speed. We've already gotten rid of, or at least we're in the process of getting rid of debanking, and the work that's being done by the acting chair at the FDIC to reveal how much debanking was going on and the hearings that are taking place on the Hill. We're getting rid of the hostility to self-hosting of wallets. We're getting rid of the hostility to crypto custody with the repeal of SOB 21. And we're getting rid of regulation by enforcement simply by firing the regulators, the enforcement regulators. So the getting rid of bad policy is happening very quickly. The delivering on promises of a crypto council, promises of a Bitcoin stockpile, the promises of perhaps capital gains reduction or elimination on crypto transactions, promises that were made in Nashville. We're seeing just the other day with David Sachs and the executive order of studies on a stockpile and other things. So the promises are being delivered on. They're going to take a little bit more time, but they're being delivered on. But the hardest thing, of course, now it's one thing to get rid of the bad policy of the last 4 years. Getting to good policy is challenging, and Bill just noted the work that's being done. You noted as well in the House and the Senate. But then there's also work to be done at the agencies. And my former agency, the CFTC, has a very good principles-based approach. And so I think it's demonstrated that it can work with that. But I think further work, as Caroline explained, is being done. At the SEC, pathways need to be developed. And I'm very optimistic that under Acting Chair Ueda, but also once Paul Atkins is confirmed and arrived with the help of Hester Peirce and her new task force, those pathways are going to be developed. So, he promised a lot. We needed a lot. We needed to get rid of bad stuff. That's happening. We need the promises delivered on, and ultimately we've got to get to good policy. I'm very optimistic it's going to be done within the first 2 years of this administration.
It seemed like under Chair Gensler, there were times when I remember going to the Hill asking for things to kind of push and advocate that the SEC would do. And I think now, at least on the SEC side, we feel like there's a lot of statutory authority they have within the realm of securities where we actually don't need Congress to be leaning on them as much. We can actually engage directly with the SEC. On the CFTC side, it's kind of interesting. You have, we now have the, obviously the big products being Bitcoin and Ethereum, both being sort of spot commodities. And it's interesting, the CFTC doesn't really have the regulatory authority to oversee spot commodity markets or even retail investors. So I guess, what do you think is needed, Commissioner Mersinger, in terms of legislation to help the CFTC, or to help there be greater authority to really be able to regulate these markets so that they can evolve properly?
Yeah, and I actually think we have more authority than most people are aware of. When you start looking at retail participants, our Forex markets are very, it's mostly retail participants, and we've kind of built that up over the years. And so we do have some experience, and, I think that there are some things we can do while we're waiting for legislation. The biggest thing legislation is going to do is kind of have a framework to decide where the jurisdiction falls. I always go back to, I think people simplify the argument of, is it a commodity or is it a security? That's not quite how it works. Everything is kind of a commodity, including securities. But once the SEC calls it a security, then it's out of our jurisdiction. And so, putting a framework around that so we can have some clarity there. But, there are things that we can do. We have some exemptive authority at the agency that we could use. There are opportunities to expand, kind of our regulatory remit while we're waiting for Congress. The other thing I think the two agencies could do is, we could sit down tomorrow and come up with a list of what's already known. What's a commodity, what's a security, what falls in SEC jurisdiction, what falls, kind of in the CFTC's area, and how did we come to those conclusions? Putting that out publicly so people have an idea going forward, again, while we're waiting for legislation. So I think there's a lot that we can do before getting to bills. But I do, at the end of the day, a market structure bill is important, but it's gonna take time. Congress does not move fast. They have a lot on their agenda, and I'm glad that they're focused on this, but I think it's going to be, maybe not a first year of Congress thing, maybe a second year of Congress.
It is interesting.
I'm dying to jump into this.
Go right in there.
Please do.
Get in there.
Because I often feel that sometimes SEC people are from Mars and CFTC people are from Venus, and they speak in different languages.
We mix this up particularly well, so we could have the SEC.
Absolutely. And you've got us in the middle, by the way.
Yeah.
We're squeezed here. But often I'll hear SEC people say, well, in CFTC world, you guys don't have investor protections. And I say, well, we got anti-fraud, we've got anti-market manipulation. When I press my SEC friends, it ultimately comes down, but you don't have a disclosure regime. Well, of course we don't, because commodities don't have promoters. When Mother Nature produces oil and gas, she doesn't issue a prospectus, right? There is no central promoters. Look, we're both in the business of alleviating information asymmetries, but in an SEC world, the way you alleviate that is you get the promoters to tell the world everything they know that the world doesn't know. In the SEC world, there is nothing that a gold mine knows that the rest of the world doesn't know. And so we address information asymmetries differently. We rely on market sources. Oh, there are hundreds of gold reports. Oh, there are hundreds of oil reports. In fact, you just go onto Twitter and you get a Bitcoin report by the second. And so what we assure is that there's just plenty of information, and let the consumer, let the market participant separate the wheat from the chaff. So it's not that we're not in the information asymmetry addressing business, it's just that we approach it different. And that's when we sit here and say, what's a commodity, what's a security, what you're really deciding is who has responsibility, if any, for putting out investor information. If it's a commodity, there is no central Bitcoin promoters to issue a Bitcoin. There's the Bitcoin white paper, and then there's a lot of public information, but there's not a central promoter. If it's a security, however, then we're going to rely on promoters to issue information.
I see Bill chomping at the bit.
Well, I wish
You're in for fun, guys. Now we're going to get really into it.
I wish the world were so easy. You could say this is a commodity and that's a security. One of the beauties about this technology is that you can create instruments that are almost hybrids. You can create instruments where they're not a full commodity. It's not like it's a completely fungible investment that you're making when you decide to buy this level one coin versus that level one coin. Bitcoin. There are differences, and sometimes there are insiders that have more insight into how those products are working. And so there are information asymmetries, which is Sumner's point why a taxonomy is so important. Like, how can we start to think about these things and regulate them in a reasonable way where it's clear enough and you don't have to engage in a very highly subjective analysis, which only today, Ethereum and Bitcoin pass. But is there something in between where we can have a regulatory framework where this question is not quite as critical, where you address the information asymmetries problem in both agencies? So it ends up in the CFTC. There is a disclosure obligation for folks that want to trade it, maybe for folks who have issued it. Some of the framework bills try to do this. Everyone has a certain level of information. So some of these really tough questions around, is this decentralized? What's it mean to be decentralized? Have a lot less importance if everyone is getting getting the adequate information that they need to make a choice and which instruments to invest in. So we think that's really important, both for the SEC to weigh in on and for the framework to address. And then, in the meantime, I do think it's going to take a while for legislation. It could be, next year's Congress. And if that happens, it'll be really fascinating to see what Hester is able to do with her crypto task force. Right now, Mark Ueda, the acting chair, has delegated all of his authority in this space to Hester, which doesn't normally happen.
Crypto mom.
Crypto mom. And he recognized that she is someone who's way ahead of him in terms of understanding the space and is very comfortable with delegating that to her. She very much wants to hear from all of you. I have talked to her about people are a little gun shy going into the building these days based on past experience. And it'll be really useful to see some initiatives coming out of the SEC. One thing I think they can do, which would be really helpful for everybody and show some good faith, would be to do some guidance on airdrops. And airdrops is one of these areas where, it's, okay, are the rules just all open now? Anybody can do an airdrop. They've been abused by folks in the past, and of course they're critical for many people acting in good faith to develop a critical sized network and get the virtuous circle of people using their network because they've gotten coins through an airdrop. The SEC has a lot of exemptive authority and would be able to be very helpful in that space and give people some comfort that if you're not creating an airdrop just to dump into a market, but the insiders are staying out of that for a while, that's going to be something that will be acceptable. So there's things like that. If you have ideas where that is helpful to your ecosystem, I would encourage you to feel free to talk to the SEC. In the meantime, we're trying to encourage them to take the first step and to show some good faith there. But there are areas like that where even though it's a new environment and people are going to be much more apt to be entertaining and comfortable with new ideas, I do think there's going to be specifics where they can give guidance and we can help them.
I'm sure most of you have seen Commissioner Peirce's speech from earlier this week on the journey forward, and I think it's a really good thing to look at because it is encouraging people to engage, to send in your ideas, to come in and visit. So I think that's hugely helpful. I can say that when I was there, those sorts of things were really helpful. Just to close out the point, the CFTC point, I can say this, that when Chris was chair, we had a very good working relationship. There was a lot of communication. We had an MOU on security-based swaps in Title VII. And I think in the last 4 years that got a little more tense. Maybe the communication wasn't as fluid as it could have been. I'm very hopeful that we will get there and that will sort of heal itself and we'll have a very productive conversation because clearly the two really need to get together, right?
Yeah, and to that point, I think that the working relationship is so good now going forward that people have decided that maybe the two agencies can merge. So I don't agree with that, but no, right now the kind of setup with Acting Chairman Ueda and Commissioner Peirce, Acting Chair Pham, and myself, we talk. The four of us talk all the time. We don't all get together because that might be a Sunshine Act violation, but we talk to each other and we discuss what's going on and what's happening and what we're thinking about. We should have these ongoing conversations. It shouldn't be a once every 6 months because you have to get on the phone. These should be ongoing relationships, and we have that now, and I think that's only going to get better as we go forward.
Maybe in the government efficiency thing, they could put you on one building and you guys could have lunch together.
Hester thinks that's a great idea. In fact, she said if I move in next to her, she will make me coffee every day.
So I think we have time for one more question. We're kind of short on time, so we're going to try to rip through this one quickly. But when you think about the lobbies that are going to the Hill, believe it or not, the crypto industry and digital assets, it's not all necessarily on the same page. So you have folks that are more CeFi oriented around central exchanges. You have a DeFi view. You have different views, right? So you're hearing different positions there. And it will be interesting to see how they resolve this. And I guess, Bill, I'm wondering, sort of seeing the different views and the different pushes, what do you think is the best way to get to good policy when we have different elements of the industry really pushing for different things, in some cases even building regulatory moats around existing models?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I do get concerned at times if you see different parts of the industry sort of lobbying for their own self-interest. I hope everyone takes a longer-term view, and we all prosper if this industry, prospers, because it has confidence in the consumer space, because we're delivering good products, because the regulations actually make sense and work. If people are out there looking for their own little, twist on Fit 21 or something that comes out of the Senate, it may serve their business model really well in the short term, but I think in the long term it probably won't. So I would just encourage everyone to think about what is a stable, long-term environment where consumers are protected, capital is raised, and this business can be facilitated.
I love this industry. It's got so much energy and dynamism. But boy, does this crypto industry have more pillow fights than any other industry I know. L1 against L1, exchange against exchange, stablecoin against stablecoin, events contract market against events contract market. It's an industry that doesn't have one, doesn't have two, doesn't have three, doesn't have four, has 5 separate trade associations. I mean, what industry has 5 separate trade associations? And so there is a real risk that this industry continues these battles at a time when we've got to make good policy. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of the people that Trump is bringing in aren't veterans of the 5-10 years of this industry and have all the scars of all these pillow fights. I've sat down with David Sachs, and he's somewhat surprised to learn about how many of these petty fights are going on. So my one plea to an industry that I love is we've got to put all that aside, and as Bill said, let's focus on the core elements. And it's a new government that's not trying to control everything. They actually want the industry to come to them with good ideas, good solutions, good frameworks, and we should be working together. And all of those pillow fights should be put aside. Fight in the commercial environment, but don't fight in the policy environment. The policy environment, it's in all of our interest to get good policy done and get it done as quickly as we can.
I'll be really quick, just to put a quick plug in for the CFTC. I think this is why principles-based regulation works so well for these markets, because it doesn't matter if you're CeFi, DeFi, TradFi, we have principles. You meet those principles however you see fit for your model. But at the end of the day, we're gonna regulate for the risk, and we have the principles out there to protect against certain risks, and we let the markets figure out how best to handle that risk. As long as they're meeting our principles, we aren't going to prescribe exactly how that happens. And so I do think that's why the CFTC has kind of been the flagship regulator for these markets, or at least that has been the trajectory of where we really should have this jurisdiction lie.
So lastly, in one sentence, what do you think is the most meaningful thing that we can get done in the next 2 years, actually get done out of Congress to help move this ecosystem forward?
Well, I think stablecoins gets done. The question is whether we can get a Fit 21 or some version of it done as well.
I think the same thing in terms of what you expect from Congress. I do think you want to see a lot more coming out of the agencies as well, in terms of there's a lot of policy, a lot of exemptive authority, and a lot of things that can be done there to actually help the industry. And they have an open mind to bringing people in and hearing and listening, and so we should take advantage of that.
I spent 15 years in Congress, and so my expectations are really low. I think the biggest accomplishment I would like to see are the committees all working together, House and Senate, Agriculture, Financial Services, Banking Committee, all of them recognizing that they have a seat at the table. That's the only way this is going to get done. And so that's what I'm hopeful, and I think that we will actually get that far at least.
Thank you all so much. Let's thank this round of panelists.